Welcome to the second part of Chapter 11 on aggregate planning and master scheduling. We will finish our discussion of aggregate planning in this portion and then move on to master scheduling. So as a quick reminder, in the first section we talked about aggregate planning and defined aggregate planning as being a planning activity in which we are planning at a product family level, such as televisions or tablets or smartphones, and we're also planning in some intermediate time frame. And the purpose of the planning is to make sure that our production that we have to execute, we do have the capacity available to meet that. So the general techniques for aggregate planning are shown in this slide. So we obviously need to know some information about what our demands will be and demand for each time period. So a time period could be anywhere from a week or a month or whatever incremental time period that is useful for us. We also need to know what our capacities are for those same time periods, what our policies are, and what our costs are. And from those, we can create different aggregate plans, alternative plans. Each plan will have a cost associated with it. So plan number one is this, and its cost is whatever the dollar amount is. Plan number two is something different, and it has a different cost. Then we can have our sales and operation planning meeting or other management meeting and look at the different plans, not only look at the cost, but look at other factors too, and determine which plan we want to move forward with. So aggregate planning lends itself to trial and error techniques. Most aggregate plans will use a spreadsheet of some sort in order to do. So spreadsheets is an excellent tool with Excel to be able to embed formulas within the spreadsheet. And if we want to change any assumptions or any of the plans, the formulas will recalculate and show us immediately what the impact of that what-if scenario would be on the total cost. Now, one of the disadvantages of the trial and error techniques is that it's difficult to really come up with an optimum plan. An optimum plan would be a plan that meets the total demand and is the absolute lowest cost. You could have three plans, and out of those three plans, one of them has the lowest cost, but there could be another plan that you didn't even consider that could have an even lower cost than the three plans that you had come up with. So there's a certain point where you just have to say enough planning is enough, and I'm just going to look at the cost for these plans that I've created. So the trial and error techniques is very important to define what your assumptions are for your trial and error techniques. So these are typical assumptions that would take place in aggregate planning. In the real world, your assumptions may be slightly different from this. You may have other assumptions that are not shown in this slide here. But the point that I'm trying to make is that in doing any type of planning, it's always a good idea to write down certain assumptions that you're going to be making in the planning so that when you are reviewing your plans with others, the other party needs to understand that this plan is based upon certain assumptions. And if they don't know what those assumptions are, they may misinterpret your plan and thinking that it has different assumptions built into it that are just not there. So another technique we have for doing aggregate planning is cumulative graphing. So this does not use a spreadsheet. This is just a graph where the solid line shows the cumulative demand for our products over some period of time. So we know what cumulative means. Cumulative means that in time period 2, we're going to sum the demand for time period 1 and time period 2. And time period 3 is the sum of the demands of time period 1 and 2 and 3, and so forth and so forth. So the solid line is the cumulative demand, and the dotted line is the cumulative supply. So you can see that for about the first 5 months or 4 months of the plan that we're actually overproducing more than what we actually have to have. And so we have an actual surplus of production for the first 5 months. But then after that, we're going to underproduce. We're going to change the last month where we underproduce so that the total cumulative production is equal to the total cumulative demand. So the total cumulative production needs to be at least equal to the total cumulative demand, but it could be higher if we wanted to do so. There are some other techniques for doing aggregate planning that we will not go into much detail with here, but linear programming, which we have talked briefly about before and will also address in other lectures as well, is a mathematical technique that is guaranteed to give us an optimized plan. That is a least total cost plan. So the linear programming algorithm will go through and look at many different plans and calculate what the cost is for all of those plans, and then choose that plan which has the lowest cost. Other techniques are simulation models. So simulation models are different from linear programming in that simulation models allow us to be able to create a computerized version of our environment, and then to be able to enter different what-if scenarios into this computerized model and see what the result will be. The simulation models is not an optimization technique. It's similar in a way to a spreadsheet, but of course it's more complicated than a spreadsheet would be. Aggregate planning can also be done in the service industry. Here are a few examples of how aggregate planning could be done. For example, hospitals or airlines or restaurants. But let's take it to a more level that we all understand, and that is universities. So is aggregate planning done here at the University of Texas at Dallas? And the answer is yes. Aggregate planning is also done here at the university. So how would we do aggregate planning here at the university? What is our product family level that we would be planning at? Well, if you think about it, our university consists of 7 schools, with the School of Management being one of the 7 schools. So aggregate planning at the university level would be planning at the school level. So planning for the School of Management enrollment, for example, planning for the engineering and computer science school enrollment, and then all the other schools as well. That's how we would do aggregate planning here at the university, and of course we are in the services business just as well. So aggregate planning in the services business is a little bit different from aggregate planning for a manufacturing company. The demand can be more difficult to predict. Capacities can have a lot of uncertainty associated with them. But the big thing is number 4 in this slide, and that is services occur when they are rendered. So one of the critical capacities here at the university are instructors. So a day of instruction, that capacity only occurs on the day of that instruction. So if I had a instructor that was available to teach on a given day, but there was no class on that day, that was a capacity that was essentially wasted for that day. In the services industry, capacity cannot move forward in time. That capacity on that particular day is lost forever. Now, let's assume that we have an aggregate plan. Let's go back to our example we've been using of Samsung Corporation. So the product family for Samsung could be televisions. It could also include their line of smartphones and also their line of tablets. So the next step we have to do is to disaggregate the plan. Disaggregation is to take the production plan for televisions, for example, and there could be, let's say, 15 different television models that are part of that aggregate plan. And then to break those quantities down into the individual television models that represent that aggregate amount. So when we disaggregate the plan, we're going to end up with specific television models, along with specific quantities and specific dates. And then that is going to result in what is referred to as the master schedule. So once again, each level of planning is going to add more detailed information than the level above. The aggregate plan has a level of detailed information that is greater than the business plan. But the master schedule is going to have even more detailed level planning than the aggregate plan. So disaggregating the plan is going to result in the master schedule. And the master schedule is going to show not only the quantity as well as the specific timing of that particular model number that needs to be produced on a certain date. So when I say specific timing, what I'm referring to is a specific day in a specific month in a specific year. So, for example, when we disaggregate the aggregate plan for televisions, we'll come up with one particular model of television, and the master schedule will show we need to produce a certain quantity of this particular model of television, and it needs to be completed on a specific day within a specific month. So the master schedule is basically the heart of our production planning and control. Many departments within the company are going to use the result of the master schedule. The marketing department, which includes the sales department, will use it. The capacity planning department, the production department, the distribution planning for shipping the completed products to our customer. They need to know what the master schedule is so that they can plan the necessary trucks, or if we're going to be moving materials by rail or whatever the method is that we're going to be moving things, they can do their particular planning. So senior management, typically within the operations organization, they have the ability to determine the business plan and the overall strategic objectives. Now, there is usually within the company an individual who has the job title of the master scheduler. Master scheduler is actually a real operations management job title. What I would like to encourage you to do is to take a few minutes and go out to one of the internet job search boards. such as monster.com or yahoojobs.com, and do a search for Master Scheduler and see what shows up. And I'm sure that you will find that there will be any number of actual job opportunities that are available for Master Scheduler. The Master Scheduler has a very difficult job. The Master Scheduler is someone who needs to be comfortable with conflict, because the Master Scheduler needs to be able to say no quite often. So that old saying, what part of no do you not understand? Well, that's something that the Master Scheduler has to get used to saying. So he needs to evaluate all the new incoming orders to see when we could actually deliver them. He needs to also be able to communicate with many people in the company, especially executives who are interested in revenue primarily, as well as salespeople who are interested in commissions quite often, and being able to help them with their customers, and to make changes if possible, but quite often to tell them, I'm sorry, this particular order has been scheduled on a certain date, and there's not anything that we can do to pull it forward. So to help the Master Scheduler in his ability to say no when necessary and his ability to say yes when necessary is the concept of a time fence. So if you take a look at this diagram, we'll assume that we are at time period 1, and you'll notice that the first 3 columns here are colored in red, and the next 2 are colored in yellow, and then beyond that everything is in green. So let's start talking about the ones in the green, the area of the time that is liquid. So what that is saying is, from a policy perspective, master scheduling policy, if we have some orders that are currently scheduled in, let's say, time period 8 or 9, and for some reason either senior management or sales executives want to try to pull those forward to, say, time period 6 or 7, the policy would say, yes, we can do that. And the reason why we can do that is because of the concept of cumulative product lead time. So anything beyond the cumulative product lead time, we are typically generally okay to be able to change dates and also to change the quantity of things. Now let's take a look at the first 3 blocks that are in red. This is the frozen time period. So these are orders that are scheduled for delivery in time period 1, or in the second one, or in the third one. So for these, most likely we've already started working on these either at a fabrication level or an assembly level. We most certainly have ordered the materials that we need for them. So any changes to the schedule, either moving them forward or to change the quantity, it's going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to make changes to these things. So for that reason, the master scheduler is going to deny any requests for changes in this frozen or fixed time fence period. That leaves us with the 2 time periods that are in the middle. So we'll call that the slushy or the somewhat firm. So those are orders in those 2 time periods. This is one of these maybe yes, maybe no situations. We would just have to take a look at what the specifics are for the change request It could be a simple change, such as to increase the quantity by a small amount or to change the date by a small amount. In that case, the answer could be yes, we could do that. Or, on the other hand, the change could be quite dramatic. If, for example, the customer wanted to double the quantity, which means we need double the materials, and we have already ordered the materials, so we'd have to go back and reorder more materials, the answer in that situation could be no. So the master scheduler will just have to look at situations. So this slide is intended to just kind of represent a concept of time fence. So a time fence for a product does not necessarily always have to be 3 time periods for the frozen. It depends upon the product. And each product could have a different frozen or a slushy or a liquid time fence policy. So the master scheduling process. There are some inputs that's going to come into it, okay? So we're going to disaggregate the aggregate plan. That's going to essentially be the forecast. That is one of the inputs. In addition to that, we need to have some inventory information. So how much inventory do we currently have of that product? And then the other piece of information we need is customer orders. So what's the difference between a forecast and a customer order? Well, what they both have in common is that they are both demands for our products. Where they differ is that forecast is a prediction of demand that may or may not come true, whereas a customer order is an actual, real, live customer who has made a commitment that they want to buy our products, and they've given us an order for that, so there's no uncertainty associated with a customer order, where there could be considerable uncertainty associated with the forecast. The master scheduling process has certain outputs. So some of the outputs are what will be our projected inventory in the future, what is our master production schedule, and then finally, any inventories that we are expecting to have that are uncommitted to any customer orders. And in the last slide of this lecture, we'll talk about how we deal with those uncommitted inventories that we may have. So, master scheduling process has a primary output, and that is a tentative master schedule is created. Now, after we have done the master schedule, we may want to do another capacity check. And remember that the master schedule is not the same as the aggregate plan. We did a capacity check for the aggregate plan, but the aggregate plan was planning at a product family level. The master schedule is planning at a detailed product level, a specific model number. So the capacities could have changed some once we did the disaggregation process. So we may want to do another capacity check just to make sure we have enough employees, we have enough equipment to be able to get the job done. And we refer to this capacity check as a rough cut capacity check. And the reason why we call it a rough cut capacity check is we're only going to be validating certain key capacities that tend to make the difference as to whether or not something is feasible or whether something is not feasible. So again, as an example of critical capacities that could be employed in a rough cut capacity check, I will use the 2 critical capacities that we referred to before here at the university. And those 2 critical capacities are instructors and classrooms. So those would be the ones that we would validate in a rough cut capacity plan. Are there other capacities that are needed here at the university besides instructors and classrooms? The answer, of course, is yes. There are many other capacities that are needed too. But the two critical ones are those, and that's what we would include in the rough cut capacity check. So we're going to go through a couple of slides on doing master production scheduling, and starting with this slide here. So we can see in the top portion of the spreadsheet looking diagram that we have a forecast for our demand, and the forecast for the month of June is 30 in each of the 4 weeks of June, and in July that increases to 40 in each of the weeks of July. If you take a look at the diagram in the lower part of the slide, you'll notice that the forecast from the top part has been copied down into the forecast row in the bottom part, exactly the same. But we've also added a new row in the bottom part, and that is customer orders. So if you go back and review the previous slide, one of the other inputs, the 3 inputs to the master schedule are the forecast, the customer orders, and also the beginning inventory level. What inventories do we have now? So in this example, we have 64 units that are in inventory. We assume that those 64 units are uncommitted. They have not been committed to anyone. They are available to any customer who wants to buy them. And if you look at the customer orders in the different months, you can see that they're not exactly the same numbers as the forecast. So once again, what's the difference between a forecast and a customer order? A forecast is a prediction of demand with a certain amount of uncertainty associated with it. A customer order is the real thing. So whenever we have both of these types of demands, we need to have some method of reconciling the two numbers, because they are essentially trying to do the same thing. One is a prediction, one is the real thing. We need to have a method of reconciling them. And there are a number of different techniques for reconciling them. And the textbook method that you use is a valid technique, but it's not the only technique. And the method that your textbook uses for reconciling the two numbers is this. In each of the time periods, it compares the forecast to the customer orders. And whichever of the two is larger, let me say that again, whichever the two of the two is larger, that is the one it will use for master scheduling purposes. So you can see that in the first time period that the customer orders is larger than the forecast. But in the second and the third and all the other time periods, that the forecast is larger than the customer orders. So let's see how that concept plays out in our master production scheduling process. So we're going to add a new row to our spreadsheet looking diagram. And the new row that we're going to add is referred to as projected on-hand inventory. And a simple way of thinking about projected on-hand inventory is to make the analogy of your personal checking account. So I'm assuming that all of you have a checking account and you have a certain amount of cash in your checking account, and on this particular day you have a certain amount of cash in your checking account. So that cash is essentially inventory. It's inventory of money. So what is the projected amount of inventory or cash that you will have tomorrow? and what will be the projected cash amount that you'll have the day after that, and the day after that, and so forth. So that's essentially the same thing that this projected on-hand inventory is going to be doing. So the projected on-hand inventory is going to first start with the inventory that we have today. So we have 64 in inventory. It's going to compare the forecast and the customer orders, whichever is the larger of the two. That's the one that we will use for planning purposes. So in the first time period, customer orders is greater. So we're going to assume we're going to deliver 33 units to our customers, and 64 minus 33 will leave us with 31 units that are available at the end of the first time period. So in the second time period, the projected on-hand inventory is going to use the projected on-hand in the previous time period 1 in this case, which is 31. It's going to then compare the two numbers in time period 2, whichever is the larger. In this case, the forecast is the larger, and we'll assume that we will have more customer orders come in, and we'll meet that forecast. That's our assumption. So if we meet the forecast and we ended time period 1 with 31, and we shipped out 30, that leaves us with 1 left. So 31 minus 30 is what produces the 1. Going to the next time period, we're going to take the projected on-hand in the previous time period, again comparing the two forecast and customer order values and choosing the larger one, which is 30. 1 minus 30 is negative 29. So whenever the projected on-hand inventory becomes a negative number, that indicates that we do not have enough inventory to meet this demand. That is the equivalent in your checking account example if you go overdrawn on your checking account. So you know that going overdrawn on your checking account is not a good thing and is going to result in a lot of pain and penalties. So if you knew that you were going to be going overdrawn on your checking account 5 days from today, that would mean you need to make some type of changes or add a deposit or whatever to make sure that you're not going to go overdrawn. Well, we need to do the same thing with master scheduling. We don't want to go overdrawn. We need to have a production come in that's going to make sure that that negative 29 shortfall is covered. So in this slide here, this is basically the same information as what we saw before, except it's arranged vertically as opposed to horizontally. So at the end of the first time period, our projected on-hand is 31. It's 1 at the second. And in the third, if you take a look at the column that says inventory before master production schedule, there's our negative 29. So we need a production to come in that's going to cover that negative 29. So using an inventory management policy that we always produce 70, and students always ask me, well, where did the 70 come from, Professor? And the answer is, that's just what we did. Someone made the decision. In this example, the textbook author made the decision that our policy for this part is 70. It could be other things, but that's the policy. We're going to have 70 come in. And so that 70, if it comes in time period 3 and we take 29 out of it, that's going to leave us with a projected inventory of 41. So that's 70 minus 21. We're going to take that 41 to the time period 4. We're going to take the larger of the two numbers, which is 30 in this case. That's going to leave us an inventory before master production scheduling of 11. We go to time period 5. You can see that we have another negative projected inventory. That's bad. We don't want that. So we need to have another inventory for 70 come in. So this is the master production scheduling process. We're going to use in the next chapter essentially the same type of logic that we're using here, except we're going to be doing it at a different level of our planning. So going back to the spreadsheet, this would be the result of the spreadsheet showing the production plan, the master production scheduling of the specific quantity on a specific date. Now we'll conclude this lesson by introducing the concept of available to promise. Now, this is a fairly important concept in the arena of operations management. It's very important because, especially in a manufacturing environment or even in a distribution environment, whenever your customers contact you and place an order, and the contact could be by telephone or it could be by email or it could be through your website, you want the ability to be able to tell the customer immediately whether or not you can fulfill their request and give them the quantity that they're wanting to purchase on the date that they're wanting to purchase. And if they're not, when can you deliver that to them? And so what allows us to be able to do that is this concept of available to promise. So let's take a look at the diagram. And let's first remind ourselves that we have 64 units in inventory right now. If we take a look at the first two time periods in June, the first 2 weeks of June, and if we sum those two together, the total customer commitments for those 2 weeks is 33 plus 20, or 53. So we have 53 units that are committed to customers. So if we subtract those 53 from our current inventory, that leaves us with an available to promise inventory of 11. So what that means is, if I had a new customer who contacted me and said, I would like to buy 10 of this particular product and I would like to have delivery scheduled in week 2 of June, we could take that requested quantity of 10 and compare it to the available to promise inventory. And if the available to promise inventory is greater than or equal to the requested quantity, we can confirm with that customer that yes, we can do that. So that's what the available to promise concept is all about. And it's very important in our business dealings with our customer that we have the ability to be able to do this and let them know exactly what we can do. This will conclude the second part of this lesson, but there is a spreadsheet example on aggregate planning that I also encourage you to take a look at.